Hey everybody, Corey here, coming at you with another knife review video. Today we are doing a review of the Spyderco Shaman. If you're new around here, consider subscribing. I try to put out knife videos on a regular basis. Also, if you're new around here, I like to open these videos up with a little summary of how I feel because YouTube statistics tell me that most of you don't stick around for the whole video, you damn bastards. But without further ado, let's get into this, and if you want more details, you can stick around for the full review, and I would greatly appreciate it. Anyhow, one of the first things you might be noticing about this knife is that it has aftermarket scales on it. Now, for those of you who know anything about me, you would know that I am not necessarily a supporter of aftermarket mods being a selling point for the knife itself. I am a true believer of the fact that a knife should be as good as it should be from the factory. You know, I'm not going to tell you that a knife is good because it was originally bad, but you can buy parts for it, you know, on the aftermarket. It's not who I am. It's not what I like. However, these scales, which are, what's his name? Aramis Akhmadov is his name. These scales are actually fundamentally different. Let me get the originals out from these beautiful, total sarcasm, neon orange original scales. And what you can see is that the Akhmadov scales have no hump. And what you can see is that the original scales have a substantial hump. Now, what I found with these types of things is they either fit your hands perfectly or they don't fit your hands at all. In my case, might not be your case, but in my case, that did not sit well in my hand. I don't know how to explain it. The hump was just in a very uncomfortable spot. Instead of sitting between my fingers, it sat like right on a bone, and it wasn't working for me. So, even though I don't normally recommend these kinds of things, in this case, if you have a Shaman and you do not like the ergonomics, I would actually recommend checking out anybody who makes scales like these that are actually flat instead of having that hump. It made a substantial difference in ergonomics for me, and it might be something for you to consider. That being said, it's a relatively expensive knife. You're looking at about 220 bucks here, and that's going to tack on probably at least another like $100-ish. So that's a decision that you're going to have to make for yourself. Me personally, 99% of the time, I don't support that kind of thing. I don't agree with it. However, I do believe that the Shaman is a good enough knife, and I do believe that there's enough value here to justify buying aftermarket scales to make the knife the way that you want it. Maybe if it's going to be your one and only knife, or maybe if it's going to be like your dedicated worker knife. I think you'll get your return on investment there over time, you know, taking into account the satisfaction that those aftermarket scales give you. So that's one thing I want to say. Aside from that, you're getting the usual Spyderco fit and finish here. And that being said, that's sometimes good and it's sometimes bad. What I've found in adjusting this knife is that I can't seem to get it centered, and it'll show it better on the tabletop review, but I can't seem to quite get it centered while also maintaining a decent action while also, yeah, like right now it's got blade play and it's got a super stiff action. This is a loaner. Tyler from Everyday EDC sent this to me, and he said that at some point he could get the action to be good, whatever that means in this case. But, you know, for me, a lot of Spydercos that I've stumbled across for some reason, it's specifically the compression lock ones, they seem to struggle with finding centering with a good action with no blade play. And if you know me, that's a big pet peeve of mine because I've got sub $100 knives that can do that. So there's no reason that a $220 knife can't. That being said, I don't think anything catastrophic is going to happen to this knife in terms of failure. I think it's a big beefy boy, and it's not going to fail you no matter what you're doing with it. Disclaimer, I don't recommend this, but I mean, this is so solid and the blade steel is so thick, I can see a world where you baton with this knife. I didn't tell you to do it, but maybe you could get away with it if you wanted to. So that being said, I do think that's a plus. From a value perspective, how do I feel about $220? You know, that is when we are reaching a point of I'm going to start being really picky about my knives. That being said, this is a thick knife. This is a big knife. The blade steel is thick. It's heavy. It's durable. It really feels like in materials, you're kind of getting your $220 worth. I mean, again, on the blade stock alone, this is thick. This is really thick. It might not be the craziest deal in the world, but you don't feel like you're getting ripped off. That being said, we do live in an age where I see no excuse for why you should pay $220 and struggle to find a good action and good centering and no blade play, blah, 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 all that. But another caveat there, this is a big knife. This is a worker. This is meant to be a worker. That being said, if you're going to use this knife as a worker, I'm guessing things like centering don't really matter that much to you. So you could just crank down the pivot, make sure it has no blade play, and you just go take it to the work yard, or where do people use their knives? Actually, you take it wherever you want to take it so that you could do work with it. So that being said, given that it's not really meant to be a safe queen, given that it seems like a knife that really wants to do work, somehow I want to give this a pass for not having perfect centering, because I really feel like it just wants to be used. So that being said, I don't really have a problem with the $220 price point. However, given that you got to slap these scales on it, it's up to you to determine if this is like a $300 knife, assuming you can even find one to purchase, which I'm going to talk about later. But overall, if you can get your hands on one, and if you've been thinking about getting one, just know that it is a big boy. It's relatively heavy, but it's a worker. If you intended to make this your worker knife, you could definitely take this anywhere with you. It's going to be able to take a beating, and you're still going to have a great knife at the end of the day. So for once, even though the original scales did let me down, this is a Spyderco that actually has me kind of excited, and I do feel like this one does live up to the hype. It's a beefy boy, and it kind of feels nice. It feels nice compared to a lot of other Spydercos that, even though they can be used perfectly well too, a lot of times they're very thin, they're very slicey, and I don't necessarily feel like I want to twist it or do anything crazy with it. But this one, ooh, that's a thick boy. So anyhow, that's my takeaway here. It's a pretty good knife. I don't think you'll regret buying it if you do. If you want more details, stick around for the rest of the review. Otherwise, I love you guys, and I will see you next time. All right, so as always, let's get started, slow roll, with some size comparisons. Here is the Shaman next to my conventionally large knife, the off-grid knife Scorpion. You can see that it is not substantially, let's just put these side by side, not substantially smaller than the off-grid knife Scorpion. As we discussed, this is a pretty big knife, so just keep that in mind for the rest of the review. It's a big boy, like I said earlier. Here it is next to the Ontario Knives Rat number 2. Maybe it makes more sense to put this on top. I'm all over the place today, sorry guys. Ontario Rat number 2. Here it is next to a Chris Reeve Knives large Sabenza, about the same space as a large Sabenza. Here it is next to a ProTech Malibu. Here it is next to a, we're going crazy today, another Spyderco that you might be familiar with, the Spyderco Smock. And last but not least, here it is next to, let's get this open. Yep. Here it is next to the Chris Reeve Knives Omnumzon. All right. Stick around for the rest of the specs and the rest of the review. Okay, so as always, I'm going to start by talking about 3 things that I think the Shaman does specifically well. So first of all, I think what most people are really going to like here is the combination of this kind of stock thickness alongside the compression lock. So for those of you who aren't familiar with how a compression lock works, I'm not going to go into too many details here, but essentially this lock can't fail without breaking through that stop pin. And let's be honest, that's just not going to happen under any regular use. It's just not a thing. Combine that with how thick the stock thickness is of this blade steel. It's not going anywhere. There's nothing you can do to this knife. Even going out to the tip, it's a relatively fine tip. But let's be honest, that's actually a pretty thick tip. I mean, it's thick all the way out. It's thick all the way down. This is a big, beefy boy. Good point number 1, you are never going to worry about breaking this knife in any way, shape, or form, or having this knife fail on you when you're in the middle of using it. All right, so the second thing that I really like about the Spyderco Shaman are just the ergos. Now, we've already discussed that I wasn't a fan of the ergos on the original stock scales, but the fact of the matter is a lot of people do like those, and Spyderco is known for its ergonomics. That being said, aside from the scales, you've always got, you've got two options. You can hold it like this. You can choke up on that finger trial, which, by the way, is really comfortable. And as always, you combine that with Spyderco's extremely effective jimping. I think I might be able to say, even though I'm not a fan of Spyderco, their jimping has always been my favorite jimping across all the knives that I've felt. They managed to make it fine enough to where it's comfortable, but it still bites your finger. From a usability perspective, this one is really nice. Aside from the ergos, you've got the compression lock for easy access. You've got the thumb hole for opening, regularly. You can kind of, well, whatever. You can... Yep, can't do it under camera. Okay, there we go. You can flip it open with the Spidey hole as you normally would. Some people might be able to reverse flick it, depending on, whether or not you're capable of that. I'll talk about how I feel about that later. But yeah, I mean, just from a usability perspective, as always, Spyderco makes very usable knives, and the Shaman is no different. So the third thing, and you're looking at it right now, that I like about this knife is essentially how popular it has become and what that means for the knife. Spyderco is always going to have parts in stock for this if you ever need to utilize the warranty or if you ever need to send it back to them. And also, more interestingly, a lot of people are modding Spyderco Shamans. A lot of people have aftermarket scales just like this that you can buy. It's kind of in the same realm as the PM2 to a certain extent. There are a lot of people doing a lot of things with a lot of materials, and there's just so much that you can do with this knife to really make it your own. So even though that's kind of a quick and dirty point, it is something I wanted to call out because, again, even though I'm not necessarily a fan of spending a ton of money on aftermarket mods, from pocket clips to scales to whatever the case might be, you can do it with this knife. So take a look around and see if there's something that appeals to you. But to me, it's nice to have that option here, especially with Spyderco, who either only releases those kinds of things in sprint runs or they just never do, and their stock stuff is relatively boring. So it's nice to have. All right, so first up on the list of things that I think the Shaman could do better. Now, Spyderco. This one is Golden, Colorado. I don't know. I don't know. Is it made there? Is it made in Taiwan, Taichung, whatever the case might be? I don't care where it's made, to be quite honest, but what I can tell you is that it's hard to get the centering on without having blade play. Can you hear this? Well, you can definitely see it. That's blade play. Now, here's the thing. Let me disengage the compression lock. This is pretty stiff right now. It won't, there we go. A little bit of shaking. Long story short, I've tried tightening the pivot, loosening the pivot, screwing with the body screws, using the original scales, using the aftermarket scales. I can't get this to a point where it is centered, along with having no blade play, along with having a decent action. And specifically, I mean, you saw me fail this knife a few times. That's not because I suck under a camera. That's because this, even with the blade play that I have right now, this action is really quite stiff. I don't know if it's exclusive to this Shaman or if it's a Spyderco thing. I see a lot of people complaining specifically with Spyderco about, they can never get their centering right, or the action is just a little off or something like that. Whatever the case might be, I don't know, kind of puts a bad taste in my mouth, especially with the compression lock. I know that this is a worker, but it really, with the compression lock, you really kind of want to fidget with it. And, at least with this one, I can't. Now, I will say, the individual who lent this to me, Tyler over at Everyday EDC, he said he got the action to a decent point. Maybe that is the case, but again, in my mind, in a perfect world, you shouldn't have to sit here for hours finicking with the knife or breaking it in for weeks or months trying to get it to the point where you're satisfied with it. That's where I draw the line. If it's not close to perfect out of the box, I'm kind of annoyed. So that's the first thing that I wanted to talk about there. Okay, so I already touched on this a little bit in the summary, but the original scales are love it or hate it. You can see again, just for comparison, you've got the straight curve here versus, the original scales with the hump right here. For me, when I was holding this, the problem for me is that hump, when I grab this, instead of sitting between my two fingers where it's really comfortable, where my hand, the way my hand is shaped, where my hand is placed, the hump is just right on my middle finger, and it's actually extremely uncomfortable pushing straight into, you know, like the knuckle of my middle finger. It's just not a good time for me. And if I'm being completely honest, I absolutely hated the original scales. You might not, but I did. And in my opinion, that's kind of a bad thing. The problem is that it's very polarizing. You either love this shape or you hate this shape, and you're going to know as soon as you get it in your hand. It's either going to feel perfect or it's going to feel off. For me, I'd rather have them be a little bit more neutral and more suitable for everyone, but it's going to vary from person to person. But again, for me, the aftermarket scales were substantially more ergonomic, and that kind of puts a bad taste in my mouth when it comes to the original scales, because I do feel like there's a very polarizing ergonomic design there. Okay, so last but not least, the final thing that just drives me crazy about this knife. Unfortunately, yeah, you see that logo right there? Same logo that's on the PM2. It's not just a logo thing, but the Shaman has, at some point, and maybe it's because it's a good knife, I don't know, there are a lot of good knives out there, but at some point the Shaman kind of ascended almost to the paramilitary 2 status, and because of that, they're so hard to get a hold of. The only ones you can ever really consistently find in stock are the ones with the half serrated edges, which, like, I don't know, like 5% of people actually want, which is why they're always in stock. Or, you know, the only ones that are in stock have this beautiful neon orange scale. And, you know, that's going to throw you off a little bit. But, you know, I don't know. Spyderco is a big enough company. If they wanted to ramp up the production on these, they could. And it just feels like they choose to keep supply low, to keep demand high, and I'm just not a fan of that. I don't like the fact that for a knife as, dare I say, plain and straightforward and in full production run as a Spyderco Shaman, you have to actually sit by your computer and wait for restocks and do the battle for who can enter their credit card the fastest before they go out of stock. It's just very annoying to do that for any knife, let alone just a production knife like this, okay? For a company as big as Spyderco, there's no excuse for why these aren't just in stock all the time everywhere. They know how popular these are. They know that these would sell like hotcakes. I'm not a big fan of the fact that you can't find one pretty much anywhere, anytime. Also, in that same vein, because this has been bumped to the status of like the PM2, for example, I can't help but feel like a lot of people might end up being a little underwhelmed when they get it in their hands. I like this knife. It is a really good knife, but kind of like the PM2, I don't think any knife can live up to the hype of the PM2, even the PM2. And I feel like the Shaman is really close to being at that level. And even though there's no doubt you're going to handle it and you're going to say, yeah, that's a really nice knife, but I don't think this is a knife that you're going to get in your hand and you're going to go, whoa, that's the best knife in the world, you know? And I feel like a lot of people who talk about this knife, they act like it's the best knife in the world. So, you know, just brace yourself there. Maybe curb your expectations a little bit. And again, it kind of plays into what I already talked about. It's like they've got this false exclusivity by refusing to make more of these, and they're constantly out of stock, and you just feel like, oh, it must be this grail, this elusive thing, when in reality, it's just Spyderco's not making enough of them when they totally could. So, you know, leaves me a little bitter. All right, so overall, like I said, it's got a lot going for it. I like this knife. I really like this knife, and I'm fully convinced that you could buy this knife. You'd be totally satisfied, especially if you're buying this knife to be a worker, not just to be a collection item, because, man, this knife is most satisfying when you go to work with it. It just, I can't emphasize enough how much of just a powerhouse this thing feels like in the hand, and it just gives you so much confidence when you're cutting open those Amazon boxes. That's kind of a half joke. I really do think that someone who actually beats the crap out of their knives would really get a lot of use out of this, and they would really be satisfied with it. That being said, I do think anybody could enjoy this knife. I don't think you necessarily have to beat the crap out of it, but I do feel like you get the most satisfaction when you go to work with this thing, because it is just begging to work, and it is just so built to work and to take a beating, and I think that's the best thing about this knife. $220 doesn't feel too dirty to me. I'm not going to talk about what happens, you know, from a price perspective when you put an aftermarket scale on it, because, you know, not everybody has to do that. You might love the original scales and you don't need to do this, but overall, those are my feelings. I think this is one that you'll like if you've been paying attention to it for a while. So God bless you if you can actually get a hold of one of these. But anyhow, love you guys, and I will see you next time.